versus prior learning assessment versus using traditional seminars. I mean, what should the state care? The state wants educated workforce, and that's what the goals are about.
Other comments, discussion on the charge? So what we've got right now in the draft recommendation is a couple of changes, I guess, to a couple of the bullets. Looking at one in the first star bullet, I'm going to use that, which is and a $1.33 or 2.3% increase for inflation. So that gets you your 360, and then the base year, including spring 2017, at the end of that second bullet. It's kind of the changes that we've put into this. Other.
I don't know if there's other comments. Otherwise, I would make a motion to approve with those two added, the added language that you have just put in there. I would make a motion to approve the draft recommendation.
Second.
All right, I would ask for all those in favor.
Aye.
And,
Aye. Aye.
okay. And then those opposed?
Nay.
Nay. We have one. And then I tried to save that because I thought the next one would have the most discussion. Save it for our third topic for the day, and that one starts on page 9 with charge 2. So as this is stated right now, we're looking at and I don't know, one thing I thought about is fund approximately $200 million because it depends on the number that we have here. But, and this is based on looking at bachelor's degrees awarded, and we had suggested an amount versus a dollar amount, because if those fluctuate or grow substantially, then that would change this. And so the funding at risk is at twice what the funding for those not at risk are. And then there was a good discussion at the last meeting, so we asked the coordinating board to go back and run some additional information, and that's what all of these other items are that you have attached to this charge. So I would, and those are pages 11 through 20. So I would ask then if there are questions or comments or discussion on any one of those items that you have in front of you on those.
Do we need to make a motion to adopt Charge 2's recommendation, and then we can discuss the components?
I'm fine with that if you would like. We can have a motion and then discuss under the motion. Okay.
So move.
Could we just, I'd move to table. Could we, the motion, because could we have discussion about amendments before we have a vote on the?
Yes, that's what we would do. We would do amendments. If the motion's on the floor,
Right.
then we can start the discussion and make amendments to the motion.
Okay.
So I'm assuming, Pat, then you're making the motion, and that opens the floor, and there are all of the different data items as well as suggestions that could come under that discussion.
That's correct.
So that opened the floor, so I'm open for any comments, discussion, questions.
I'd like to start with page 15. Pell recipients versus Pell eligible. It seems to me that the proxy is for at-risk students who are coming from lower income families. If you use Pell recipients, you're rewarding those that actually took out the loan. If you use Pell eligible, that's the full group of individuals who come from low-income families, which is what you're trying to target. So I would make the recommendation that if we adopt this, that we use Pell eligible for one of the at-risk categories as opposed to Pell recipient.
Just a question about the Pell recipients. Is that for the loans or for the grants?
Those are Pell grants.
That's the grants, yeah.
So it's the grants, not the loans. It does not include the loans.
All right, these are Pell grant recipients or Pell eligible recipients.
And Paul, I don't know if you can speak to the students who were Pell eligible and did not get Pell grants. What types of scenarios do those tend to be?
Sure. So the person who collected this information, what they did was they took all the FAFSA records that we have, and there's a flag in that record that indicates whether you're eligible or not. And they just took all the student IDs and grouped them together, and then we matched those to this 3-year set of degrees that we have for the graduation bonus. But also in those files are what they call C flags, and those are exceptions to where you might be eligible, but you're not eligible for federal financial aid. So you're eligible for the grant by the calculation, but you're not eligible, for example, like if you have a student loan default, then you're not going to get your grant. Academic probation would also be one of those, but again, what we looked at this, we looked at whether you ever received a Pell Grant, and you might fall into academic probation for 1, 2, 3 semesters, but it's not going to be your entire academic career. So that isn't a good example. Selective service is an example. If you haven't taken care of that obligation, then you wouldn't be able to receive the federal aid.
Are there other scholarships that would preclude someone from?
Well, I thought that initially, but specifically on the federal website,
Okay.
Pell eligible is basically you get the grant regardless.
Okay, thank
It
you.
doesn't diminish it.
Okay, thank you.
So undocumented are not included in this, in the Pell eligible?
If you
Because
have
they're not that-
citizenship issues, first you have to have a social security number in order to be eligible. But there are citizenship issues that you can run into even after having a social security number that would knock you out of it.
Another case may be if you're getting veterans benefits, but you come from low income. They're still at risk. They wouldn't take out the loan if they're
That's
getting
right.
their
Grant.
education funded from veteran grant.
Now, I'm not sure if those get flagged as Pell eligible at all, but I'm not sure. I don't have the full grasp of this data to speak to all the nuances. There's one thing I would like to caveat to the numbers that you're looking at. When we did this, the methodology we used, we did not restrict that set of FAFSA records to just when they were enrolled. And in some cases, I did poke in and see that somebody was Pell eligible in a semester before they had enrolled, and then one person had been Pell eligible only after they had graduated. And so if we did employ this in the model, you can kind of look at this as a high-end number and not necessarily the number of Pell eligible. It will shift.
Other comments, questions? So are you looking at that as an amendment then, as to change the terminology from recipient to eligible?
Just that we make sure that in the definition of at risk, it's Pell eligible, not Pell recipient.
Oh, there it is.
So I have another question related to the transfer students. In looking at all the data, one of the things that we're going to find out how many of those students we have the ACT and ACT scores. I know it's here someplace, but can you tell me a little bit more of, how successful you were in obtaining that data, or how many transfer students we might miss because we don't know SAT or ACT scores?
Do you want to provide the stats, and I'll talk a little more about it?
Sure.
Thanks.
So you'll find that we have SAT, ACT scores for 73% of the students who start at a university. And that number is 56% for those who transfer in. Of the 14,274 transfer students who didn't have that score, 70% of those, or about 9,900, they were already at risk for receiving Pell. That number will be a little bit higher with Pell eligibility.
And in terms of looking at the data, we were surprised to see that in terms of what's reported to us on our CBM-00B, we only had about 71% with SAT scores. And Paul made some calls to institutions, and there's several reasons why those scores aren't, students don't supply those scores. Sometimes it's older students or they're not requiring them. So we don't have them for a fairly large number of the entering students. It's not, the percentage wasn't that different from what we had for transfers, and that surprised us. We thought we'd see a bigger gap there.
Can you help me understand who's all included as included in transfer student? Is it just those that are coming from community college into the GAIs, or do you have it if they're moving between general academics as well?
So in order to be considered a transfer student, we used a simple definition of having at least 30 semester credit hours at a community college. The example that you're talking about, where somebody might start at one university and then transfer to another university, we didn't include that because we suspected that they would have the same enrollment requirements as their final institution, and so we would have their SAT, ACT scores in this particular case, if they were falling into that group of students where that would be required.
Paul, I obviously don't have any data to talk from, but that one bothers me a little bit, that transfer from one four-year institution to another, from one university to another. Because I still believe that many of those students do not have to submit, even if they had them, they don't have to submit them if they're transferring in any more than the community college students do. I guess I'm struggling a little bit with why we would do that for the community college student, but we wouldn't do it for the individual who's going from one university to another.
Go ahead.
I'm assuming, I mean, if you look at a transfer, so for example, if somebody transferred from my university to another, you usually have to have the transcript for that transfer. And when you require that transcript, the SAT score is on that transcript. So if you had that at the original institution, it's going to be on there. I suppose if there was a four-year that does not require ACT, SAT, then that would be similar to a community, coming from a community college. So
if you were to enroll in your first university and say they had the same admissions requirement as the one that you finally went to, we would have your CBM-00B record from that first institution, and on that would be your SAT, ACT score. So when we do the math for determining if you're academically at risk, we pull that score off of the B report from your first institution. So we have your score if you don't fall into one of the exceptions where you don't need to provide an ACT, SAT score. Like, for example, perhaps you're an older student who enrolls, or you were in the military, or you somehow satisfied that requirement with some other means besides the SAT, ACT score. So when we were doing this and trying to give you the purest possible data, we didn't want to inflate the transfer numbers with those students, because then that would show a higher percentage of transfer students that had the score, and it would kind of muck it up just a little bit. Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying.
I'll also add, we did have a conversation with one of the testing companies, and we're working on, seeing about a possibility, and we need to have, we've been playing phone tag with the Texas Education Agency, but we're also going to talk with them because they do get some scores. So we'll follow up on that if we do find that there's additional information available for those students.
So I have one more. Based on the numbers and so on, there still will be about close to, a little bit over 4,000 transfer students that you couldn't find the ACT and ACT scores. So could those students be considered at risk too? Based on my experience, if you're a student from a transfer student, without an SAT and ACT score, could be a student that could be in the category of a student at risk. But in this case, it will not be, because since you don't have the score and they are not Pell recipients, then they will not be considered.
Well, if we go to Pell eligibility, if they're Pell eligible, even if they're a transfer student, it would be picked up under this number. So even if they didn't have an ACT, SAT, if they were Pell eligible, they would fall into that at-risk category. So it's not both, it's either or.
Yeah, but even like that, you're still missing about over 4,000 of them. Isn't that true? That
You're right, you're missing
Yeah.
about 5% of the students.
yeah.
But I'm not sure what assumption I would make with regard to what their score would be. Because a lot of individuals are going to two-year colleges because it's 1/3 the cost of starting with me. And they may have had a 26 ACT, but it just cost a heck of a lot less.
Right.
Paul or Dana, could we just clarify one more time what we're talking about to determine eligibility for this, quote, bonus? Are we saying Pell is the only?
No, right now, what you're looking at, as amended, is if a student is Pell eligible, or if they have a below-average SAT or ACT score.
Okay.
That's to get the $1,200. It would still be $600 for any graduate. So all graduates would be.
Well,
they would
I had some of the same concern that Cesar has. Then 4,000 students is still a lot of students, even if it's only 5%. To certain institutions, it can make a significant difference. Without, if we're saying they have no SAT or ACT, so we'll assume they're not at risk.
Yeah, I think the point brought up is it's not going to be 4,000 students. There's going to be some percentage of that are not academically at risk, and so they wouldn't fall into it. But I see your point. It's well made that there's a number that is not included.
Yeah, what we're capturing is around 97% of the students, undergraduates that graduate every year. So we're not covering 100% of those. Now, I will go back to that funding drives behavior, and my guess is we will be more diligent about acquiring ACT and SAT scores and reporting those in the future. Just making an assumption there at most institutions, but and so I think that potentially could increase that number from 97% of the students, but.
Is that for the native and transfer combined? And but of the transfer, you're capturing about
Less, right.
about 95%. Is that?
Because it's 97% is overall of the undergraduates that receive a degree on an annual basis.
Okay.
And that would include those that start natively at your institution or those that transfer. Now, and please, if I'm wrong in my recollection on any of the numbers,
Yeah, I thought we were a little bit lower on students that we had scores for, Paul, based on the work that we did. Is that correct, where we talked about the 70? And I just want to make sure I'm looking at this here.
I'm not sure
Okay.
on the fly.
We basically said for completers, an SAT or ACT score was reported for 56% of the transfer and 73% of the non-transfer. So that would be for all students or just those? I mean, it seems like that would be for all students, and you're not just talking about those who were Pell eligible there. Is that correct?
Right.
Yeah, so I remember being surprised that I thought we would have a higher percentage of scores.
But I think what Dr. Hoyt's saying is
Yes.
that even with that, we're capturing a certain percentage
Yes.
of all the graduates?
Oh, I see what you're saying, yes, through Pell or through the SAT. Thank you,
One
yes,
of the,
that's
one of the
correct.
two
That is correct.
mechanisms, we're gathering 96 to 97% of the
Okay,
students.
yes, thank you, I misunderstood.
I think we were at 96% with Pell recipient. If we go to Pell eligible, with the number that increases, that's probably going to put us closer to 97% overall of the students that graduate.
Oh, you were
And-
way ahead of me. I get what you're saying now.
Yes.
You're saying that by dropping the 3 metrics that we removed,
Right,
even if we had gone and included those, that we're still at this high percentage and very few of them. And even that, you have to realize that there's some margin of error associated with the data. It's not, this is a lot of information to collect. The institutions do an amazing job every year, but it is a lot of information, and there is some variance with it. So we have to accept that.
I mean, does this answer your question? I mean, your concern,
Well, it answers the question. It doesn't alleviate my concern.
so you're thinking there's still a fair percentage of
Well, it's all I'm saying, Ed, is that, and I realize that, you know, we go back and take another look at these things as you're talking about, Julie, to try to get it as close as we can. But, you know, when we chose to drop out those other characteristics, when we dropped out age, for example, which has historically been a part of determining an at-risk student, we say we're going to get it as close as we can get it. And I'd like to get it as close as we can get it. But I'm saying even 3 or 4 or 5% is still a lot of students.
Other points on that? I agree. I mean, it'd be nice to run a model. I'm not sure we'd ever get a 100% model anyway. That's the issue with dealing with data is it's not that, part of it is what data we turn in or don't turn in. The more data we turn in, the higher that percentage is going to be.
And I understand that we're trying to make this thing as simple as we can. But I also believe that when we were dealing with all of the characteristics, which makes it a whole lot more complicated, it's also heightened our ability to identify, I believe, a larger percentage of those students than by automatically dropping those out. And if we're willing to accept, and, you know, given everything else, I'm probably willing to accept, willing to support, but it still creates a problem for me in wondering about that hole and how big that hole is, and having a model that says we're going to assume that we're going to have a 3 or 5% hole in this.
And I agree, and there's the other things I think that we're in at risk under the definition currently is age, whether they're full-time, part-time, and GED.
GED, yeah. I think those were all the elements, and that's usually how the national definition is calculated. I believe those are the elements that are used, correct?
So is this on page 16 that tells us how many more we would capture under that? If we had the part-time and the older students and the GED?
That's right. So the all degrees column shows that if we included the part-time in there, we'd get an additional 2,000. Of course, that would be averaged over 3 years. 420 for those who start a little bit older, and 20 degrees for those who have a GAD.
I believe those were the categories that we used when we did the performance-based funding several years ago, right? I mean, that's what was used in. So is there a reason why we would not include those?
The only purpose for culling them off was just to simplify the model?
Keep in mind that what we did a couple of years ago not only had differences in terms of how you define risk, but it had a lot more differences in how you determine outcomes. So if we want to keep it simple, I would suggest we stick with this. Because the major way in which it isn't as simple as before is that we don't have the same outcomes.
I agree.
Just for clarification, I think, Dr. Hoyt, you mentioned it when we were talking about charge one, but if we're going to this simpler, what is in charge two currently, it is the recommendation that this is contingent on funding the I&O and infrastructure formulas first, and that if they're funded below our charge one recommendation, that we would not recommend allocating funds for charge two. That we would recommend legislature allocate the funds for charge one first, and that this would be above charge one allocation.
Right, and that's in the draft, it's the bolded portion is since the funding for the graduation bonus is for degree completion and not for basic support, shouldn't replace any portion of the operation support funding.
But
Yeah,
I think your language is stronger. I like more the way you said than the way it is said here.
yeah, this is
Yeah.
just really what we had in, it was last time's committee, the language that was the prior outcomes based is that this recommendation is contingent on funding the
Yeah.
I&O and infrastructure formulas. That was pulled from the last committee's recommendation, so we could put similar language in it that if it's not, again, this recommendation is contingent on funding the I&O and infrastructure formulas at or above the 5.146 million. In the event the I&O and infrastructure formulas are funded below this level, the committee does not recommend allocating funds for graduation bonus.
Yeah, I would prefer that language than the one that is here.
My point would be, it's just a recommendation on our part, and I would ask the question, if the legislature made the determination that they didn't want to increase by $3.60, but they only increased by $3, and then they really like this performance funding, the way we proposed it, how many of us would turn down those dollars?
Yeah, but I would place to you a different scenario. That would be great, and in that case, then you prefer this language. But the other way to look at this is to say, well, we're going to fund the other one at a lower level, but because we are going to allocate money to this, to the second one because we like it more. So yeah, it depends how the politicians are thinking.
Yeah, all I'm saying is I think we can make it very, very clear that our first priority is the 360 plus the amount for space and so forth. But I'm not sure it does us any good to put in a statement that says, and if you don't do that, we won't take anything else. That just doesn't sound too politic to me.
I guess the point being that if the legislature has funds available for higher ed, we would like them put into charge one.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right, you just don't want them to reduce charge one to put money here, is all.
With those changes then, I think we've talked about, the fund approximately, and making it Pell eligible, and then the language I just added, could I make a motion then to vote on the recommendation with those changes?
Could I ask?
But I'm not sure there was agreement entirely on the language on that, the additions. So that's where because what Pat was saying, I think, was that we don't want him to say, well, if you don't do this, we don't want you to do the other. I mean, his example is well taken. We're going to increase this by $3 and we're going to do the $200 million. We'd all prefer that we get that large of an increase in state funding. So it's some way to say that and say our priority is the priority is the fully funding the formula, the basic support or operations support.
Before consideration be given to.
Yeah, but that's our priority. So I'm trying to think of how to
But if we
tweak that language a little bit to say that would always be our priority.
Yeah, I think we could say that as the first is our priority, so as to maintain operation of the institutions or to maintain the level of quality of education to our students. But then in a separate sentence to say, to provide greater incentives to achieve the goals stated by the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, the 60 by 30, we recommend in addition this.
But is it so contradictory to say that an amount above that amount that we're recommending, that in other words, that amount be above the first priority?
Be in addition to.
Be in addition to.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in other words, that we recommend that you fund the $3.68, and then above that, once that's funded, we ask that funding for the 60 by 30 goals be.
Yeah, I think it's important to be clear as to why we're making the recommendation for the 360 increase.
Right.
That's basic operations. And then the 186 or 76, 200, whatever it is to provide incentives or support or
Right.
to achieve the 60 by 30.
So I think the difference in the language is just not to express that second part in a negative. I mean,
Yeah, I was trying to rewrite it. I put first, the committee's first priority is fully funding the operation support formula in support of basic operations. Any additional funding in support of, I'm trying to look at how in support of the 60 by 30 to enhance, the goals of 60 by 30 but is to state that first priority is fully funding operations support formula in support of basic operations.
I think we want to keep in mind that one of the goals of the 60 by 30 is to keep the student debt down. And so by fully funding the formula, we're meeting that goal of 60-30. So we're not ignoring 60 by 30 by choosing that as our first priority. We're trying to keep this affordable because the smaller institutions will have to continue to raise designated tuition if we don't continue to support those institutions through state funding. So we keep
It's kind of
forgetting
like
the
an
debt
additional,
portion.
yeah, it's a, we've called it an alternative. So alternative funding in support of 60 by 30 would be this.
Or specifically go
For that completion. Really So if we do I'm trying to rewrite and retalk on the fly here. First priority is fully funding the operations support formula in support of basic operations. funding for the graduation bonus for degree completion initiatives is, because I was trying to reflip,
Supplemental
because we
to
kind of put
priority
the
one.
operation support at the second, and we really want the first priority to be that operation support, and then the second one is funding for the graduation it's a graduation bonus funding
Isn't
is
it-
for degree completion.
Is in addition to,
Yeah,
we say,
yeah, is in addition to.
The language that we used last year was outside and separate from.
It is outside it, yeah. So the funding for the graduation bonus is outside and separate from. I can reread this.
I have a question. Since I'm new to the committee, on page 13, you show something here that was done 2 years ago. Could you tell me what was that? 2 years ago, you compare the outcome-based funding with metrics that was developed by the committee 2 years ago. What was that?
Sure, I can walk you through that while we do some more rewriting.
Okay.
Good sideshow. So the outcomes-based funding model included actually the same degrees that we have here. They're undergraduate baccalaureate degrees, 3 years of them averaged. On top of that, we have these same at-risk measures that were included. So we defined an at-risk. We also had several of the measures that were not included. On top of at-risk, we had a per 100 FTSE. We had the degrees multiplied by the institution's graduation rate. We also had what I call milestones or retention metrics. So you got a point for every student you got an additional 30, 60, or 90 semester credit hours for. All that was then scaled so they would be comparable. Then each institution was allowed to prioritize each one of those metrics so that it would be able to accommodate its particular mission. There's more, but I think it's enough.
And, yeah. So I think.
Could I ask
sorry.
about the cost analysis on pages 19 and 20 about what do we know about the additional expenses of graduating at-risk students? And it looks like that it come back statewide at 21%. It's lower than I expected. So, should we be looking at a graduation bonus for at-risk students that's 21% higher instead of 100% higher? If that's the case.
I can tell you why 21% isn't necessarily the right number for the graduation bonus. The analysis that was done here doesn't necessarily take into account all the costs associated with working with an at-risk student. All I could really do was tell you some basic metrics of how many semester credit hours an at-risk student attends versus a non-at-risk student. And so I took your institution's average undergraduate cost per semester credit hour that we calculate in the expenditure study and applied that. It's not specific enough to necessarily get to some of the support costs that are associated with at-risk students. Talking to some of the people at institutions, for example, students who are at risk might spend a lot more time in a tutoring lab than a non-at-risk student does, and there's an additional cost to that that really isn't factored in with these numbers. So I couldn't get it as precise as you'd hope in this short period of time, but it does tell us that they do take additional hours, they take longer to graduate, and fewer of them do complete. And so that helps to at least understand that there are additional costs associated with enrolling at-risk students.
Yes, and it is one of the targets in the 60 by 30 text plan that we improve the completion rate of Pell eligible or of students who receive Pell, so our economically disadvantaged students. We want that rate to match the completion rate of the students who are not economically disadvantaged because it is lower.
Well, this is true, but it's also, the number one thing we can do to reduce student indebtedness is improve their time to degree. The major costs of going to college, the major driver of student debt is going to be, how much time are they into or out of the labor market. So, so it would seem like that we want to encourage timely graduation in general, right? So if we want to reduce student indebtedness. So it seems like it's just sort of arbitrary to stipulate 100% versus 20% versus 50% versus 200%. Is that a fair characterization?
I'd like to add a little more clarification to the first point about the 21%. That's based on the total cost of instruction. So the graduation bonus isn't really designed to cover the cost of instruction. It's just for student services. So if you see on page 20, using this estimate, the cost for a student who is not at risk to graduate is $77,425. The cost for an at-risk is $93,778. So it is certainly much more than that $600 differential. The other point I would make is there are two ways to consider the graduation bonus. One is a reimbursement for the additional expenditures associated with making sure that at-risk students graduate. And second, it's an incentive. It's an incentive to institutions to do more to make sure that those individuals are successful. I don't think you can consider it just to be a reimbursement.
Well, but if we thought like economists, like none of us actually do on this around this table, right? I'm sure. But then you would want to, if you really wanted it to be an incentive, then you would need to offset the additional costs that you incurred, right? So otherwise, there's going to be built-in disincentives. There's always a concern with higher ed institutions that one of the ways that they don't improve their graduation rates is to increase their selectivity and not serve at-risk students, right? So you would want to try to offset some of those additional costs so that there's, ideally, at least it's break even if there's, and perhaps even an upside to it. But it seems like that, we'd want to have some way of sort of costing that out and saying, okay, so here's how we're estimating kind of what those additional costs would be.
But just to follow up on your point, it is one of the advantages of this particular method that I remember in South Carolina when performance-based funding started, exactly what you just said happened, that because there was such a premium on graduation, then universities just raised their admission standards, which raised their graduation. So some incentive is built into this piece, that recognizing the incentive to graduate students that are at risk. You're not going to get the $1,200 unless you do graduate them. They're the most difficult to graduate, and if you're going to get universities to give them some incentive not to raise their selectivity, then now how we value that specifically, that's the challenge. Do you have any idea how that would be done?
Well, I think we way undershot it. I think if you're really serious about creating incentives to graduate at-risk students, there would have to be much more significant advantages. That's why it's suggesting that it doesn't make sense for us to have all of the incentives around just production of semester credit hours, regardless of the characteristics of the student, and then sort of modest, marginal, arbitrary add-ons if you graduate an at-risk student, because that doesn't at all address the real costs of graduating an at-risk student. I think it sends some sort of message. It sends a message that it's not as important to us as just producing semester credit hours.
My only kind of comment is that this is the first time I've seen anything like this in the state. This at-risk issue has been growing, and now it's recognized in national data that the demographic change is significant, and it's trending in a direction that it's going to be more significant. So while I totally agree with your comments that, ultimately we've got to take on the whole formula system, it does seem to me that this is a step in the direction of putting in front of universities and policymakers, legislators, that this is a reality that we're facing, and this is a step. If it's a modest step, I agree, but it is a step in the right direction.
In support of what Ed is saying, just for the sake of discussion, we've got to find a way to break into this type of funding. We've been trying for years. We've done the very complex models that try to take everything into consideration. We've never gotten anywhere with them for obvious reasons, including legislators who simply are not interested in looking at them. So even if we do it on a very small scale, if we ever want to do this, we've got to find a way to get in the game and to break into this. And in spite of the reservations I have stated on a couple of things, I think it is a way, best chance I've seen in the term I've been on this committee, to try to break into this thing and get people to look at that. It's just a whole lot easier for many legislators to glance at those numbers and say, I'm just not interested in that. We'll look at the formula, and that's all we're interested in looking at.
But could I throw out there, I mean, just for the sake of discussion, I mean, I think the idea that they're going to have an extra $200 million is probably, that's idealistic, right? Okay, optimistic. But if you were thinking about, so you want to create an existence proof, right, so that you could do something more interesting with the formulas, and we want to encourage innovation, you're going to get more out of creating sort of inviting institutions to apply to be part of experimental site type strategy, where there would be $200 million that would be focused on helping to accelerate what they would be doing with new delivery models, or using it to help offset the potential costs of funding more on our actual costs versus our historical costs. If we funded more on our actual semester credit hour productions versus what it was a couple of years ago, that might be a step in the right direction if you want incentives to work. So I'm not really sure, like, if you have $200 million and you say, okay, well, we want to use $200 million as well as we can to encourage kind of innovation and completion, I'm not sure that I understand. I mean, I understand the methodology. I mean, it's something like this has been batted around for more than a decade, but I'm not sure that why we would want to settle on it and recommend it.
So I wanted to make a couple of points back to what you were saying before. With the cost compared to this graduation bonus, there's something that you really do have to consider, and I'm not arguing with you, I agree with you. We haven't estimated the true cost of an at-risk student, and this $600 additional wouldn't cover that, but it's not your only revenue source associated with graduating at-risk students. One of the things that I think the data really show out is at-risk students don't complete. So if this incentive gets it to where you are able at your institutions to complete them at a higher rate, you've got the other revenue sources, you've got the formula to continue that. So you get formula funding for the rest of that attendance that you wouldn't get now.
But the formula didn't pick up our actual costs either. I mean, we're sort of...
Right. Well, the formula is not intended to pick up all the costs.
It sort of funds us at the average of historical expenditures, but that sort of thing. I mean, it doesn't pick up actual costs. There's huge variations across the institutions. So I'm just throwing it out there that, I mean, I think making a general recommendation that we ought to have incentives for innovation. We ought to have incentives, particularly for kind of evidence-based approaches and increasing the graduation rates of at-risk students. But we don't have to settle on a methodology for that in the recommendation. You could certainly say that there should be some substantial portion equivalent to 10% of the funding that's allocated above and beyond and separate and not supplanting with all those caveats.
Well, I think in part we're doing that. We're just not doing it on, say, an RFP basis. What we're doing is providing the institutions with additional funds. And I know that if I want to increase that, I've got to be innovative. I've got to come up with new programs. I've got to come up with new ways to mentor students. So it's built into that. Now, if I just take whatever the dollar amount is that I get for this and just use it the way I've been using funds in the past, shame on me.
I mean, one of the criticisms of Texas, though, we take too little money and we spread it out like peanut butter too broadly. So this is not going to offset your actual costs of setting up the innovative programs for the most part. So it's going to. I think it ends up constraining you in what kinds of things you can actually achieve.
Now, given my budget, an extra $2 million be huge, absolutely huge in terms of what I can do for student services, student support, and helping students graduate.
Harry, yes.
One of the first reasons why I believe, Harrison, that putting $200 million aside in request for proposals that's a one-time. First, you're going to go through all this process to make the application to get the money, and you don't know whether you have it for 1 year, 2 years, or for however long. I think the biggest incentive here is really not for the. It is can we find any other way than the basic formula to give out money to institutions? And we haven't been able to do that. For all the other times we've been here, we have this statute that we have to propose an outcomes-based method of delivering incentives to the institutions. And we've done it for all the other times I've been on this committee, and it's gone nowhere. In part, I think it's going nowhere because it looks very complex to a legislator. And then if you have someone whispering in their ear that, well, we weren't really for this, that it was by statute or the commissioner wanted or whatever, it didn't go anywhere. I don't know whether this one's going to go anywhere either. But I think it has some potential to attract quite a bit of support throughout from the institutions, and it just might work. Now, the $200 million is really inconsequential in terms, as you noted, of the basic formula. But it could become more, if it is adopted in the first, then it may gain adherence throughout the institutions. A greater willingness to perhaps put more of the formula somewhat at risk in terms of moving it over to some other kind of performance-based outcomes. So that perhaps it could be the toe in the door in terms of producing what we would all say has a greater impact in the future of affecting incentives and outcomes. But historically here, we've come up with stuff that right off, you wouldn't need an economist to explain. And it's no surprise that they did not go anywhere. So I'm hopeful with this very simple approach that perhaps we can make some progress on this. For example, we haven't said anything in this, and I'm not advocating this at all about, well, what kind of degrees do we want in Texas? What do we need? But hey, we might be able to get there. But I will repeat, if we're going to go into any other greater complex methodology for doing this, we're going to need a different group than this, and a lot more time to do it. So I think we've made reasonable progress for what we can do. Perhaps not what we would like to do, but what we can do. Thanks.
Well, and I would agree. I think, that goes back to the institution. If I want to look at increasing graduates, I want to look at what the market demands are and see where my degrees are going, and that's one of the things we evaluate on new degree programs. And when you're looking at innovation, I've got to be innovative to award more degrees to at-risk students, or it's more quickly, or it's not going to happen. So, I hope it encourages some of that. But I'm going to go bring us back to Noel's comment few minutes back, where we had the two changes within the language, and then I think you got a good draft. If Julie can read that on the, yeah.
Sure. The first priority, whoops, there goes my screen. The first priority is to fully fund the operations support formula in support of basic operations. Funding for the graduation bonus is outside and separate from the operations formula and is intended to fund degree completion initiatives in support of the state's 60 by 30 tax goals. And I'm open to editing if
The proper motion for that would be either move that, or is that an amendment to the original?
You made the original, so I would assume these others would be amendments. The
Okay.
amendments would be fund approximately $200 million. We would have Pell Grant eligible, and then it would delete the bolded sentence at the bottom there with that entire language that,
I make a
was just
motion
read.
that we adopt that amendment.
Second.
okay. We have a motion and a second. Other discussion? If not, I'll ask for those in favor, say aye, please.
Aye.
Aye.
And a like sign for those opposed. All right, that motion carries. So actually, I guess the planning for another committee meeting is probably not necessary since we got through our 5 charges. I will tell you that the report that is presented is the draft recommendation languages that now have become recommendations, as well as the minutes for the various meetings are presented as the entire report to the commissioner and the board. Obviously, we can accumulate those and send that out so everybody would have a full copy of what the report will be. But at this point in time, I don't know that we have a need for a December meeting. All right, so then unless there's something else, I would say we are adjourned. And thank you for everybody's very hard work and support on this. And for those of you that are on the call-in as well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your work, Dana.
Thank you all very much. I'm sending this language to Paul and David right now. So if my computer runs out of juice or something.